Hello, teachers, and welcome. Today, I'm going to talk about students who are a little bit too chatty and what you could do as a teacher in order to help those students as much as possible. So, hit the subscribe button and let's get started. Okay, so as many of you know, in the past I have made a video talking about how to deal with very quiet, very shy students on iTalki or any other English teaching platform. Well, I had not even considered the opposite of this effect, the fact that some students are very, very chatty on iTalki, and particularly in conversational classes, it could be difficult to get things under control so that you could help those students and give them the correct guidance that they need in order to help their speaking skills. So thank you very much to one of my patrons on Patreon who actually gave me this suggestion to make this video. I really appreciate it. And today I want to first start by talking about why it's important to deal with overly chatty students, what overly chatty students sound like, and also different ways that you could deal with these students. So first of all, saying that we need to deal with overly chatty students sounds like being chatty is a problem. It is not a problem. Most of the time, it is actually a personality trait. Sometimes it is a reflex that students have when they are nervous or anxious for a class. I've had many students who will be talking a million miles a minute because they are quite clearly nervous and anxious, and that's completely understandable. On the other hand, there are many students who have the personality to be chatty, and when you meet a teacher like me who likes to be chatty, it's kind of like a hurricane meets a volcano, but it's definitely a beautiful disaster at that. So there are definitely many pros that come with being chatty. This is not necessarily an issue, but it is something that could be disruptive in a class, and it could impede on your ability to help your student. So the first clear reason why being chatty could potentially be an issue in class is the fact that your students may not be receptive to constructive criticism, right? And if your students come to the class for that, then of course there needs to be times where you give your students feedback. There has to be pauses and breaks for you to be able to do that with your student. On the other hand, speaking at a million miles a minute could also cause your students to make more mistakes. And if they are not reflecting on the mistakes and not reflecting on the accuracy, then that could be an issue because it could hinder them from improving their speaking competencies. Finally, if your students are speaking a lot, it could make it difficult for you to actually do your job and to give them instructions and directions in the class. And at the end of the day, that's what they're paying you to do. So even in general English classes where I'm working on reading, writing, speaking, listening, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, if my students are too chatty, then it could cause these instructions to be delayed, and it could take some extra time to get through it, which isn't good for you as a teacher, and it's not good for your students either. So what does an overly chatty student look like? Well, as you know, it's somebody who talks a lot. That's the obvious first thing, that they talk a lot. However, it could go deeper than that. I've had some students who not only talk a lot, but they question a lot, right? They ask you a lot of questions, and questions are fantastic, right? But of course, if you want to get through class and you want to give the correct directions, then there is a certain amount of questions that could be permitted before you move on and start the lesson and start the activity. Overly chatty students could also be those students who interrupt you and speak over you as a teacher, and that may be due to cultural reasons and maybe part of their culture and maybe part of their personality. But again, this could potentially, depending on you as a teacher as well and what your style is, that could be a hindrance in class as well. So just so that we're clear, chattiness does not always equate to friendliness. It could also equate to how critical your student is, for example, or their communicative style, for example. Here are some things that you could do with your students, with your overly chatty students. The first thing is to definitely have pauses in the class, right? So give them some silent time to complete tasks. Now, I'm very skeptical about silent time, and I try not to overuse it because I don't want it to be perceived that I am trying to get my students to do something else to kind of keep them busy so that I could sit back and have a coffee or something like that. That is not what they're paying for. I make sure that every time they have silent time, so it could be to prepare for a quick presentation, it could be to watch a video and then report on it, it could be to quickly read a text and report on it, it could be to add vocabulary to their glossary in class, etc. Anytime they have silent time, I make sure that there is specific production that comes out of that so that my students know that I have their best interest in mind, and this is not a break for me, but it is an activity for them. Okay, so that's number one right there. Number two is to give your students resources so that they could explore and research outside of class. This is specifically useful for your students who question you a lot, who may undermine you, for example. If they ask you, if they kind of challenge you on one of your explanations 2, 3, or 4 times, on the 3rd or 4th time, I would usually say, okay, this is a resource right here. This is an article. I'd like for you to read this for homework. And if you have any questions, we could talk about it next time. You could always send me a message whenever you would like to. I'd be happy to respond, but we have to get through the class right now. So again, this is my style as a teacher. Some teachers would be completely fine with saying, my student has a question. I should attend to that as long as it takes. That's great if that's your style. For me, I like to have a schedule. I like to stick more or less to the schedule. I am very flexible, however, but I like to find the middle ground. And for me, 3 or 4 challenges, and I'll usually just give them a video or an article based on this concept that they're challenging me on so that we could talk about it more in the future. Okay, third, and this took me a long time to get to, and it is very difficult to do. It's giving your students some tough love, right? It's giving them some feedback. It's great if you give it to them orally and textually, by the way. So if you have like a Google Doc or something like that, to write down the feedback in a feedback column and to explain it to them and expand on it orally, that's great. You could even make a SoundCloud recording, giving them feedback for that class, but being very brutally honest with them and telling them, look, your use of vocabulary is fantastic, and it usually is with chatty students. Your confidence while speaking is brilliant. The speed at which you speak is just extraordinary. However, your accuracy does need work, and here are some things that you could do to improve your accuracy. Yeah, and unfortunately, slowing down is usually one thing that you have to do in order to break down the pieces of language and to build your students back up again. Fast does not equate to good. In fact, some of my students, the best things that they do is take pauses while they're speaking. So that brings me to the 4th point, which is focus on intonation, in your students' intonation. Focus on the rhythm at which they speak, the speed at which they speak, and to try to integrate more transition phrases into their speech. So integrating different words such as however, for example, on top of that. Watch this. I really like fruit. For example, I love apples, oranges, and bananas. You see the pauses that I'm taking there. Well, a lot of overly chatty students are trying to speak so fast that they don't take those pauses. And not only does that cause them to make more mistakes and give them intonation, which isn't typical for English speakers, but on top of that, it's making it difficult for their speaking partners, i.e. you as the teacher, to jump in and to give them feedback or to just jump in and join the conversation. So that's something you may need to do as well. Okay, number 5, something that you could do is to have more activities in class. And an activity could be giving them silent time to give a presentation, for example. It could also be getting them to read something to you. Yeah, and that could allow you to kind of have a little bit of wiggle room, a little buffer, a time to kind of breathe, right? Where your students could read something from an article where they're not kind of going off the cuff and they're not improvising, and they could speak with ideally well-structured, well-organized text in a way that's not necessarily their thoughts, but that is put down into a piece of reading. So for example, they could read something aloud, and then after that you could get them to summarize the information, right? So then they're going to be speaking using their own words, but this time they're going off of the vocabulary, off of a well-structured text which they had just read. Okay, and the final thing that you may need to do with your overly chatty students is to really break it down for them and explain the rules of your class, or your I know it's hard to have rules, but perhaps the spectrum within which your rules exist, right? So for me to say you're only allowed to speak after I speak or something like that would be on the very strict end of the spectrum. But to say I would appreciate it if you don't speak over me and you wait until I finish my thought, unless if you have a very important question, right? And to be brutally honest with them and to tell them that that's what you would suggest as a teacher, and to explain why it could be useful for them, not only in the class, but also in their professional lives. Now, be very careful with this, because they could feel like belittled if you are trying to explain to them how to communicate, because again, this could be a cultural thing, and you don't want to undermine your students' cultures and to put it like, speaking over someone is always a bad thing and it makes you impolite, for example. That's not what we want to do here. But you are a person just like your student is a person, and if for you it works better to have a little bit more structure and a little bit less chaos, then that's absolutely okay. For me, I fall a little bit in the middle of this spectrum, and that's the reason why, as you saw in my other video talking about quiet students and shy students, I gave suggestions on how to add a little bit more chaos, how to add a little bit more enthusiasm and excitement, and just to dive right into the wild in your iTalki class, right? So this goes both ways for me as a teacher. This is my style, not only as a teacher, but as a person. But of course, when you go to class, you are the teacher, right? And they are the student, and that doesn't make you any higher than the student, but it means that you, if it's a conversational English class, of course, it depends on what gels the best between your communicative style and their communicative style, in which case you may want to lay down a few rules or a few kind of like vague rules for your students. And on top of that, if it's an IELTS class or a general English class, then you have some material that you need to get through, right? So for that reason as well, it would be good to lay down some rules. And for me, I never do this at the beginning of class. I feel like it would be a little bit too, personally, it would be a little bit too like aggressive to say this is what you can do and this is what you can't do while we're speaking, right? But this has only happened maybe 10 or 15 times where I've had to speak to my students and tell them, okay, I'm trying to get through the instructions. You need to wait until I finish the instructions before you ask questions, because you're asking questions which I am about to answer. Yeah, and that's happened with 10 or 15 students, maybe a few more of the hundreds of students I've had on iTalki. And most of the time they understand it, and sometimes they forget and they end up interrupting me again, and I just remind them, right? So those are a few things that you could do with your overly chatty students on iTalki. Okay, teachers, I hope you find that helpful. I hope this doesn't seem too mean, too strict, nor too lenient. This is just my approach as a teacher, and we're all different. So let me know what you do with your overly chatty students or your shy students. Let me know in the comments section below. I really hope that this helps you out. And until next time, keep smiling.